All right, and we will get started. I want to say a special shout out to all my people from Tennessee and from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm representing both of those places today. But hello to everyone and welcome to today's webinar. I am Courtney Robertson, Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Collective Impact Forum. We thank you for joining us today for exploring the Racial Equity Toolkit, featuring Toolkit developers Dominique Samari and Paul Schmitz. Next slide. Thank you. So a few tips for today's webinar. One, we do want to hear from you. Although we are in Zoom webinar, we still want to hear from you. So we invite you to share your questions in the Q&A box. So we do want to note that there is a space specifically for questions. So you can put those questions there. And then you also have the ability to upvote on questions. So if there's a question that's resonating with you, you can kind of plus one that to move that up in the chat. We also invite you to engage in the chat. So feel free to talk to one another. We see folks sharing where they're representing or where they're calling from today, but also to have dialogue there, share resources, etc. A recording of today's discussion will be made available later this week, and we will send an email once that is available online. You all are also able to download a PDF of this presentation with the link that Tracy will share in the chat for you all. And then the presentation will be shared with the recording as well. Your live captions are automatically on, but if you wish to turn those off, you can go to live transcript at the bottom of your screen in your webinar menu and choose hide subtitle. And then lastly, if you experience any technical difficulties or have any questions, you can please feel free to either share that in the chat, or you can email Tracy Timmons-Gray at tracy.timmons-gray@collectiveimpactforum.org, or you can message her directly. And we want to send a special shout out to Tracy for all of her efforts in getting today's webinar off the ground. And we'd like to start today's session with a land acknowledgement. Now, we do acknowledge that this session is presented, we want to acknowledge rather that this session is recorded and presented on the traditional land of the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Menominee, Ohlone, Coast Salish, Muckleshoot, Stillaquamish, Suquamish, and Duwamish people past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people of these tribes. And then we also want to know about the indigenous lands in which you all are calling in from. So we'll place in the chat for you all two links. One link where you can enter your direct location, or you can just enter your zip code and find out what indigenous land you are sitting on today. And we invite you to share that in the chat, and we'll take a minute for everybody to do that. And thank you all for doing that. And you all can continue to look that up if you are looking. So we would like to acknowledge that land recognition and acknowledgement is just the first step in strengthening knowledge, relationships, and accountability to better support our Indigenous community members. Relationship building and understanding community context are key factors for successful collaboratives. As you build your own deep knowledge of the many layers within the community or communities in which your collective impact effort exists, we invite you to take action to learn, build connections, and to strengthen relationships with your Indigenous community members, including Native-led organizations and governance bodies, which can be very helpful, When thinking about what next steps to take, the Native Governance Center, a Native-led nonprofit organization that supports leadership development and tribal governance support programs, has wonderful resources to both support the acknowledgement of land that you are on, but also next steps beyond that land acknowledgement. So we will include a link to the Native Governance Center in the chat, but you can also go to them at nativegov.org. Right. So what we all are here for today and who we're here for today. At the Collective Impact Forum, our mission is to support communities engaged in equity-centered, place-based systems change. In doing so, we are continuously seeking ways to build connections across people and ideas and to make the approaches to this work as practical as possible. The newly released Racial Equity Toolkit is a companion to the Stanford Social Innovation Review Winter 2022 article, Centering Equity and Collective Impact, which outlines 5 strategies initiatives should be implementing to embed equity in their work. Now, we often hear from practitioners such as yourselves that the article and strategies are great, but that they continue to struggle and have challenges around actualizing those strategies in their work. Well, the toolkit is a step to doing so, and so we're very excited and honored to dive deeper into it today. Here to discuss the toolkit with me is the dynamic duo that developed it. First, Dominique Samari. Dominique is co-founder and principal at P3 Development Group and is an experienced strategist, coach, and facilitator who helps organizations build and sustain equitable and inclusive change, specializing in supporting leaders as they navigate difficult and complex change. And then her colleague, Paul Schmitz. Paul builds the collective leadership of organizations and communities to achieve greater social impact through his roles as senior advisor with the Collective Impact Forum and CEO of Leading Inside Out. He is also the author of Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up, and the former CEO of Public Allies. Now, I do encourage you all to read more about Dominique and Paul and also follow their work. So with that, I will hand it over to Dominique and Paul to start us off. And if you both could briefly start your presentation with sharing with the audience what brought you to this work and what keeps you in this work.
Thank you, Courtney, and hello, everyone. Excited to be here and walk through the toolkit this afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world. So what brings me to this work? As a young person, and even as an adult, I think I've always struggled with a sense of belonging and had a sense that the world, at least my world, was designed for the benefit of others, which made me curious about how I and other people who maybe look like me were supposed to navigate this world that was not designed for us. So that curiosity, I think, as I got older, translated into just kind of how I observed and moved through the world and wanted to support others in shifting kind of these context structures and systems that would help everyone have a sense of belonging. So I describe myself as a recovering attorney. I practiced criminal law for 10 years. And as a young attorney, I this natural curiosity coupled with how I saw the actual systems impacting communities of color really made me interested in how to do this work in a way that felt like supported more upstream, right? So like how do you support the humans in changing the behavior, systems, and structures that are necessary to shift these dynamics to actually create the world that I envisioned. I also have this like undying hope and faith in humanity and believe that it's just part of my life's purpose to support this work. And so that's what keeps me in the work for certain. Paul, what about you?
I guess for me, when I think about this work, particularly around racial equity, I was someone who got into a lot of trouble in my teens and had a very difficult path up, and had a lot of situations where I saw clearly that people who didn't look like me faced harsher consequences than I did. And that's kind of what began my kind of journey into this work, was that recognition and building on that recognition of just seeing how other people, when I'm saying other people, I mean people of color, were facing consequences for things I had done or was still doing that I didn't face, that I got the benefit of the doubt. I got help. I had certain privileges that made a difference for me. And in my teens, I was in a treatment facility for a period of time, and then I was on the streets for a period of time, and I saw very clearly how those differences manifested. And that's what began that journey. And then I had the incredible opportunity of getting involved in Public Allies back in about 1993 and helping lead that organization for many years, which was always an organization that's predominantly people of color led and working at. And And we were focused on building leadership where people didn't see it and didn't acknowledge it. And so, but to do that work, we had to constantly do the struggle and do the journey and do all of it. And so I think I've been in this journey for a long time, and I think it's a journey without a destination. It's just something that you commit to doing and doing the work and trying to keep doing the work and learning. And I don't know that there's any point I've been along the continuum where I wish I couldn't go back and do other points of the continuum, because we're constantly learning and growing and gaining. And so that's kind of how I got into this particular work. And when I became involved in the collective impact work, the first article I wrote about it was a critique of collective impact based on the lack of power analysis, based on the lack of equity, and based on the notion that at the time it was being presented as a kind of top-down approach to get the top leaders to decide things for communities. And I wrote a critique at the time called The Culture of Collective Impact. It is back in like 2013 or 14 or something. And that's what started my journey into collective impact and equity together. Was I came into the forum specifically because of my critique that collective impact was ignoring the power analysis, the equity, the community engagement, and things like that within the work. And so that's what kind of brought me in. And as we last year, and the thing is, the Collective Impact Forum, as it's kind of evolved, it has really continued to evolve our learning and understanding of these issues. And so when I came in, I was kind of the person initially kind of bringing a critique, and what I saw and what excited me about working with the Collective Impact Forum was, rather than hearing me critique it and saying, you know, why is he critiquing it? They said, why don't you come and get involved? And my colleagues, Jennifer, who's been with me from the beginning, and others who've been working there throughout, have all really focused in the last decade on really bringing that work to the center of it. And when we thought about what to write and how to frame 10 years of learning about collective impact, the article that we did together was called Centering Equity, because when we thought of what's the most important thing we could say after 10 years doing this work, it was that equity has to be central to collective impact. And, you know, just even in the definition, we created a new definition of collective impact that's based on describing it as a network of community members, organizations, and institutions that advance equity by learning together, aligning, and integrating their actions to achieve population and systems level change. And I kind of write it this way because I like to point out that equity is kind of in the center of the definition. And the reason why is because if the purpose of collective impact is impact, it's achieving population and systems change, you can't get to population change unless you address and redress the inequities and the disparities that are within that population. And so, and then to address those inequities and those disparities, you have to actually operate in a way that's inclusive and equitable to achieve, you have to be equity to do equity. And so for us, it was that recognition that equity is not just something that's kind of a side piece of the work, it's central to it, because you can't get to population change unless you address equity. And we define equity, we borrowed and built on the definition that Junius Williams and his colleagues at the Urban Strategies Council created, which is equity is fairness and justice achieved through systematically assessing disparities and opportunities, outcomes, and representation, and redressing those disparities through targeted actions. And what I've seen in years in the field is I've seen a lot of uneven practice. I've seen groups get better about the disaggregating data and looking at the disparities in their communities. I've not seen a lot of improvement in terms of asking the questions of who's at the table, who's making decisions, who are we listening to, who are we engaging, who's getting the grants. And so for us, it really, you know, for me, this toolkit was born on, okay, we wrote an article, how do we actually give people some tools, some guides, some examples that can help kind of correct some of the things that we've seen as patterns as Dominique and I have worked with various collective impacts around the country. Dominique, what came up for you in thinking about, you know, when we took this on and why we needed to do this from your experience?
Yeah, it's definitely a practical guide to support the article. And so after the murder of George Floyd, I feel like we saw a bunch of organizations who felt compelled to address issues of racial inequality with a greater sense of urgency. So looking both inside their organization at their internal practices and culture, but also looking at how that was impacting how they advance equity through their work. But as the days, months, years unfolded, those strong 2020 equity statements started to peter out, and we started to default back to this kind of muscle memory, like the tables still weren't diverse, we still weren't addressing how power was shared. And it was because now the statements were so strong, causing a huge gap between what organizations were saying and what they were actually doing. And it was having an outsized impact on the people of color inside of those organizations and the beneficiary of the work, which were often people of color. And the equity and inclusion work was not being centered. Instead, it was just the opposite. It was being pushed to the margins. And so it was in a position or in a committee, often with no power or decision-making authority and not fully integrated into the overall strategy of the coalition or collective. The toolkit and how we thought about this was, of course, to create some practical guidance, but also to produce some of the productive conflict that's necessary to advance this work. And so the productive conflict that we are talking about is like the productive conflict that you need in order to call the question. Like, I don't think this is what we mean when we say that we're walking the talk. I don't think this is what we mean when we say this is what equity looks like. I don't think this is what we mean when we say our decision-making is equitable. And so how are we actually creating the conversations and building the tables and creating the structures that let us have those conversations? How are we configuring folks to have the conversations that they need to have and using that configuration of people in a purposeful way, right? Because if people aren't proximate to that conversation, then we're not changing the way we're doing the work. And like Paul said, if we're not changing the way we're doing the work, it's still uneven practice. At the end of the day, you're still doing the work inequitably. You're not actually, the collective isn't actually serving its purpose if it's not addressing the inequities and disparities.
So as we thought about building a toolkit around this, we built it around the 5 practices that are in the article that was in the Stanford Social Innovation Review and tried to find ways to illustrate it with examples and practices and recommendations and activities that people could use to build those. It's built on the idea that both it supports doing personal reflection, and there's a lot of personal reflection in it, but also team conversation, that the goal would be for people to both do some of the work internally themselves and to have team conversations, ideally with facilitators when possible. It's also a toolkit that's meant to create action, that it's important that people make visible action commitments to implement practices and lessons. And at the end, there's a work planning session that's really about that, because a lot of times we see people share their intent, but not really share their commitment. And the reality is commitments with deadlines and accountability are key to equity leadership. And the other thing we want to note was there's a lot in here. And we realize that people are in different places in their journeys, and that some people are ready just to start a conversation. Some people are ready to go deep. And so we wrote it with a thought that people could use the entire toolkit to really do a comprehensive kind of learning and improvement process around the practice of equity. Or people could use it a la carte and use individual tools or worksheets to get started where they're ready and build toward doing more and more work in the space. And so it's meant to be able to be used either way. We also recognize that how people approach it is different. And I can say that when we first wrote it, I think Dominique and I were writing it more thinking of white allies or potential allies and not thinking about the whole community of people who'd use it, and then realized we had to think differently about who might use it. Dominique, do you want to talk a little bit about this piece?
Yeah, so for white folks, it really is about reflecting on your journey towards consciousness and what is your journey towards allyship? But this is the thing, we're all just humans working in this work. So for people of color, and I'll share a couple of examples as we move through this, but our lived experience as people of color impacts how we show up inside of this work. And so really using the toolkit as an opportunity to reflect how your life experience has shaped you and shaped how you show up inside of this work and how you approach this work. And also making sure, and this is really important, and especially for my people of color on this webinar, that you are taking care of yourself. And so oftentimes the people of color bear the burden of this work. They bear the emotional burden and emotional labor of this work. And the work is important, but it's not important enough for you to sacrifice yourself. It's not that important. And so making sure that you are taking care of yourself and each other, and that we're building bridges and on-ramps. And so I just want to say that, like, you know, this is a much longer conversation, but we are in an era of division, and there is something to be said about effort. And I navigate the world mostly through energy and instinct. And so I'm always like, if I can feel into someone trying and it actually feels like trying, then I can build a bridge. If someone says they're trying and it doesn't feel like trying to me, then I can burn a bridge, right? And so that depends on what it looks like for you. But I think in this era of division, building bridges and on-ramps to this work is really important. At the end of the day, we have to be clear about where we're trying to get to and the best way to get there. And it's often not by burning bridges. It's just not. And so looking at like how we're giving each other and giving each other some grace and actually lending support as we all feel our way through this work.
Yeah. And just one last comment before we get into it, which is we called it a racial equity toolkit, not an equity toolkit. And the reason for that is we find that there's a lot of people more comfortable in the US context saying equity instead of racial equity because they don't want to be controversial. And the reality is, when we look at the disparities in the United States of America, which is a context in which Dominique and I live and write, and in Milwaukee, which has some of the worst disparities in the country where both of us live, to not name it to us is a form of inequity. And so the reality is that in our context, the substantial disparities that we see in every aspect of social condition are first racial and then often intersected with other things. However, we also understand that people using this toolkit may be in communities that aren't as diverse racially or are in other countries where they have different issues around equity. And we also recognize there's other populations that face marginalization and disparity and oppression. And so we want to recognize that we believe that these lessons can be used for different forms of inequity and disparity, but we framed it within racial equity because we believe that that is, at least in our practice, the fundamental start of this work. And if you do that work well, you'll do the other work well. And so that's where we started. But as we began this process, the other thing we realized when we looked at the article and the 5 practices was that something that I've learned over many, many years, and that Dominique as a friend and colleague is always reminding me and everyone else, which is you got to do the you work before you do the we work. And you've got to like look inside first. And so we realized that to do this work of collective impact centering equity meant we had to give people an on-ramp to do their own work first and make sure that people had ways of doing that.
So starting with looking at yourself is critically important because we are, after all, humans doing human work. You're not out there building widgets. You are humans supporting humans and being better and doing better and creating a better world. And how we show up in this world impacts the outcomes of the work. And how we show up in this world is shaped by our history, our families, our experiences. And it's necessary to unpack those in a really intentional way so we get a sense of our blind spots and our growth edges. And of course, it's not enough to just do the personal work. That has to actually translate to a different work product and a different way of being. But it is critically important to start here. So we've included 4 exercises to help users gain a deeper understanding of who and how they came to be in this work. And so the equity journey is really all about taking a closer look at what has shaped you as it relates to this work. So looking back over your life and looking at like, okay, what has my personal journey been around racial equity? Like Paul said, like he had a rough and tumble youth experience, and so came to some insights around that, like what shaped your journey around this, and what have been your experiences and the people that have shaped that for you. The next exercise is around historical forces, and this is especially important for the white allies who are using the toolkit. So zooming out enough to look at, we talk about privilege, again, and now it's just become such a part of our lexicon, but like, what is the specific privilege, and like, what are the policies and historical systems and structures and practices that have shaped the privilege that you have and that have produced the racially disparate conditions and outcomes from which you likely benefit? And so really taking a close look at that, and inside of the toolkit, Paul provides some examples. And then third, looking at the behavioral patterns and the implicit biases. So we all have patterns of behaviors and biases. They're a result of our parents and our cultures and our families. There are automatic ways of being. So for example, someone says something and all of a sudden I'm defensive, but my friend is withdrawn. And so I use the example of my friend Danielle often as an example, especially for my people of color on the call, who came to the realization during a racial equity training that she was intimidated by white men, and it was causing her to show up in the work a certain way. So really getting clear about like, oh yeah, what are my triggers and how is that informing how I'm showing up and how I'm making decisions? And then looking at your network. And so who are you surrounding yourself with? Are you in an echo chamber, or are you actually including people who have been exposed to different experiences, perspectives, et cetera? And it's opening up your world and giving you a broader understanding, which of course increases understanding and empathy, which will support the work that you're doing.
So after looking inward and doing the internal work, we go into the 5 practices. And the first is grounding the work in data and context and targeting solutions. And in the article in the toolkit, we begin with targeted universalism, which comes from the work of John Powell and others at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. But it's the idea of how do we use data to disaggregate, when we have a goal, our data, identify those disparities, understand the factors that support and impede different population segments who are in different places relative to our goal, and targeting our strategies in ways that address and redress those inequities directly. And so this approach, which a lot of us have embraced around that, is important, but it begins with, you've got to have data. But so you be data driven, you also have to contextualize it. And here we use some practices from asset-based community development and others to look at how do we collect, use, and share data about communities? How do we engage those closest to the data to interpret it? Because again, data is information. Who's interpreting the information? How are we understanding the information? What information are we presenting? Are we presenting a picture of community that's whole? Are we framing it in ways that look at those who are doing well as those who are not doing well? How are we framing, talking about, and shaping the way and the narratives we understand about community? But also, how are we understanding what's going on? And again, interpreting it not just through our own lenses, but hearing from others. And we talk about things like data galleries, sometimes called gallery walks, where we either virtually or in person look at data together and give people questions and have people make meaning of it to shape our understanding, or how we also look at how we collect data. And one thing I would just shout out to is one of the things the Collective Impact Forum regularly provides is workshops on equity, but also on data from Junius Williams. And I would just strongly recommend those workshops if you're looking at understanding how to approach data in a way that's both just and equitable. And so that's the first practice that the article covers. And we have people look at as activities how you're using equity within your data and how you're using it in terms of making meaning from data, and how you're using data to address inequities in the work.
And the next thing we talk about is focusing on systems change. So systems change is changing the conditions that hold the problem in place instead of just focusing on programs. And of course, system change takes longer, but programs alone don't create the population level change that many of the coalitions that you all are supporting are seeking to change. And so many of the racial disparities are a result of systems. And whether they intend to or not, they create these disparities. And so looking at how to address racial equity, you have to also look at the system. So we talk about and this is from and I have like the the pyramid up on my wall that I keep right by my desk, but looking at the top layer of the pyramid, which is structural change, the kind of the explicit level, looking at policies we talk about in the toolkit. Policies are, of course, govern how we do work in our cities and communities. So the example we give is a city zoning policy that's preventing multi-unit buildings which restrict affordable housing. Looking at rules and practices, ways that programs and services operate, so the rules they follow, how they engage people, et cetera. And so you may have something like a summer league that requires sign up between 1 and 5, Monday through Wednesday for parents at one location all the way on a far end of town, which is like not conducive to parents actually signing up. Or resource flows, how money and people and knowledge and information are allocated and distributed. And so how money and resources are flowing. And you may have a funder who's setting up a dynamic that's creating competition instead of collaboration, or a funder that is focusing on all white-led organizations instead of Black and Brown-led organizations. So when we get to that next level, which is the semi-explicit level around relational change, and that's all about relationships and connections. So around the issue, what are the quality of connections and communications between actors in that ecosystem? So really looking at how organizational and individual leaders like either fail to collaborate or don't do a great job collaborating, which actually holds the condition in place. And the example we use is actually from a project that we worked on, which was around folks providing eviction support, and there just wasn't a lot of collaboration in the ecosystem. So folks facing eviction had to call multiple agencies during a very, of course, urgent and time-sensitive time in their lives, and couldn't really get the support they need without having to be stressed out because of the lack of coordination. And it has to do with the trust, of course, between those agencies. And of course, looking at like, does that trust cross race, and which organizations have relationships with which ones? And then there's power dynamics at this level. So look at who's making decisions, how those decisions actually limit innovative ideas, solutions, new partnerships. And so we may have language in place around inclusive decision-making or around collaborative decision-making, but at the end of the day, is it 2 or 3 people with the most power who are having a meeting before or after the meeting who are really coming in to override the group's decision? And then at that last or at that bottom level of the pyramid, it's about transformative change. And really, this is the implicit level, which is harder to see, but is super impactful. So what are the deeply held beliefs, stories, and assumptions that really influence the actions of individuals and organizations operating within the system? So the example that we provided was about a local newspaper covering infant deaths that creates a false narrative. And the one that I think, I hear most often is just the way the media portrays perpetrators of violent crimes. And so it perpetrates perpetuates this stereotype and narrative about people of color and propensity towards violence. And so just looking across each of these, and then as a coalition, identifying which are the 2 or 3 systems that have the highest priority for you all that would help you move towards equitable outcomes.
So the next area is looking at power, which is something that Dominique talked a little bit about in the systems change pyramid. And here, and we had a lot of conversation about this when we were writing the article, but the way we thought of it is, first, you gotta own who's at our table. And how is power distributed? Are there power imbalances? How does our composition impact decision-making? And to understand who has formal and informal authority. We often, when Dominique and I are working with groups around collective impact and building tables, we always differentiate between those who have positions of authority, which give them some level of formal authority, and those with informal authority, which means that they have authority by virtue of their relationships, their credibility, their level of trust, and the importance of having people with both. And a lot of times we tend in our culture to mainly think of authority as being the formal when the informal can be so important. Who has the trust, credibility, and relationships that they can move that can be a huge source of influence and work. And understanding kind of how that sits and where power sits within our group. But then we have to understand, like, how do you share power? Because one of the things that we've really struggled with a lot of collective impact efforts is sometimes when we mix people with formal authority and informal authority, those with formal authority will delegate out and leave the table. And the important thing is we actually need them to use their power at the table, not with the table, but with the community. And we need that to hold together. But to do that, we also have to make sure that we're doing it in ways that continue to share power. So what some groups weight community voices more. I know of one group where a majority of the resident members had to approve a resolution just as the majority of the board does for it to pass. Groups have created resident advisory tables, some that are in the governance structure where the annual plans of the action teams go to the resident council and they give feedback and approve it before it goes to the steering committee, and leaders from the resident table sit on the steering committee. And so that the resident actually have power within the system. Last word, which is a process where before any final decisions, the people with lived experience or community representatives at the table have the last word before decisions. And again, having people from the community involved in resource decisions that affect their communities and their lives. And finally, there's cultural practices that share power. And those can be things like naming and making explicit commitments to address the imbalances, talking about it at the table, and talking about how we're mitigating it. Building relationships. Sounds simple, but it matters. And as people get to know each other and get to know each other's stories and their intents and why they're there, it makes a difference. Facilitating inclusively to build trust, making sure we're not calling on the same people, making sure that we're calling on those we haven't heard from yet, making sure that we're explaining things in ways that those who are maybe newer to the work or newer to the experience can understand, serving as jargon cops to solve for acronyms or jargon used at the table before anyone has to ask what it is. Creating space for learning, engaging those, and then this is important, engaging those with formal power to use it on behalf of the group. Again, those with formal authority at the table, that's not a bad thing that they have it. It's a question of how are they using it and who are they using it for? And so there's ways that people can use their power to help others build power. There's ways they can use it to influence on behalf of the group where they can wield their power. And so thinking about how do people like actually use the power they have in ways that support the group. So again, we share some examples and practices to really analyze and look at like what's our current level of power within our group, and then how do we share power structurally and culturally to address those imbalances within our group.
And then next, listen and act with community. And so here, when we say community, we mean the intended beneficiaries of your work. And so first, build actual relationships with community-based leaders, organizers, and residents. And Paul and I do a community engagement workshop, and we always get the question like, well, how do you build relationships? And I'm like, well, how do you build relationships in your actual life? Like it's not rocket science, but one of the easiest ways to do that is to actually go and support community-based leaders, organizers, and residents when it doesn't benefit you, when it doesn't benefit your coalition, when it doesn't benefit you individually, and go and actually just support people in the work that they are doing and actually show that you can show up for people. Learn about the community history and context. So know that you are operating in a specific context with a specific history. And the example I always like to use is like when people have something that's working really well in neighborhood A, and they want to just directly translate that to neighborhood B without kind of understanding the context of neighborhood B, then it usually falls flat for some reason or another. And so really take some time to understand wherever you're working, like the actual context and history, and like what has worked, what hasn't worked, and kind of what has been the journey. Know who's trusted and viewed as an asset by community members. And so for you, it may be that the head of your local foundation is trusted and viewed as the highest asset, but it may be that in the neighborhood in which you're working, or in the geography in which you're working, that Miss Sandy is the ultimate authority here, and that she gets the last word. So understanding who the informal authorities are, or even formal authorities inside of the geographies and communities in which you are working is critically important. Be aware of white savior syndrome. I think that's enough to say about that. Just don't. And be purposeful and act with community. And so the idea is not to create a solution and give it to community, but to actually work alongside community to develop and implement solutions. And I think Paul talked about, and we often talk about, kind of this context and content expertise. And so the examples we include in the toolkit are like women of childbearing age actually being peer support for a birth initiative, or seed dealers being peer support for a farmer suicide initiative, or barbershops kind of being the hubs for a reading initiative, and so on. And so you're actually working alongside and using the community assets that you have in place, and not trying to create something kind of in theory or in a lab and like import it into a community, but really working, and what that requires is really working in an integrated fashion with community, which means that you're like taking the time to understand the history and context, and you're actually building the relationships so you know what's going to work. All right, Paul.
And we reference in this piece, and we didn't go too deep in this piece because we separately had worked on a community engagement toolkit that is on the Collective Impact Forum website and has been there for the last 6 years or so, and that a lot of people have found helpful. And so for people who want to go deeper, and also the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, which is where I've learned a lot of what I've learned on this work, and is an amazing resource for doing community building, and really community building where community is the center of the work and not just the people that we go to listen to and then do our own thing. And finally, the fifth area is building equity, leadership, and accountability. And here, I think the thing that Dominique and I thought about is we started thinking about leaders we admired and people that we thought did this well. And what are the things they do or have done that really demonstrate that? And we built out some practices, and we built out 2 charts, one for people to do individually to look at what's my level of commitment, and then one for the coalition or team to look at and say, what's our collective level of commitment? What are the things we're collectively doing? And on the individual side, we talked about, it starts with, again, authentic relationships to share and learn, seeking diverse perspectives before decisions about communities and populations not our own, that we don't just like make assumptions, but we really listen and try to understand and hear from others, that we promote anti-racist narratives about communities, populations, and issues, and interrupt biased or racist narratives we hear. When we hear them, we've got to stop them. That we name our own bias patterns and invite others to hold us accountable when they see them. That's a critical one. To make sure all groups and tables we convene are racially diverse and inclusive, and that we're always analyzing and correcting for disparities in participation, that we know who's showing up, who's not showing up, and we're always putting further effort into correcting any imbalance or inequity or lack of inclusion at our tables. And so if we're noticing some people aren't coming, why aren't they coming? We reach out to them and we recruit more people, and we constantly are looking at that and not accepting if our tables aren't as diverse as we know they should be. We show up for leaders of color, people of color-led organizations, and public issues impacting communities of color. not when our interests are involved. That when there's issues happening in the community, we show up for them, whether not because it's like this is my organization or foundation's interest, but because it's the community's interest, and I'm going to show up for people because I care and I'm committed and I'm an ally, and not just for again those things that connect to my organization's mission. And finally, and this is the big one, visibly take stands and be willing to risk and sacrifice resources and relationships in order to stand up for racial equity and justice. I know a foundation leader in another community who, a community foundation leader who fired basically a board member over by taking a stand when this person said something racist in a public meeting, and actually lost their donations and resources, but stood up for what they believe. And to me, that's an example of what it means to do this, that we're willing to sacrifice. We're willing to not do just do it when it's safe and convenient and risk-free for us, but we're willing to take stands when there's risks involved. And so these are 7 practices that we look at and invite people to rate kind of where do you think you've been so far on these, and how have you practiced this, or what step could you take to practice it further? And then we have a similar list related to your organization or coalition. What are the things that you're doing that could move up this list? And finally, the last part of the toolkit is just recognizing that, like, once you've done the toolkit, what are you going to do? We didn't do this toolkit to have conversations. We did it so that people would take actions, implement policies, implement practices. And so we invite people to prioritize 5 individual and 5 team or coalition action commitments, including when they'll be committed and who you're going to have hold you accountable. Because I think the first part of equity leadership is not just making commitments, but being accountable for them. There's no leadership without accountability, and there's no ability to do this work without that. Dominique, anything you'd add on that, or in the end?
No, I mean, yeah, you can't just, you got to get beyond talk. And I feel like the discontent and frustration that we're seeing right now is because we haven't, in large part, gotten much beyond talk.
So with that, I think we're ready to take questions. And again, the toolkit's available. It's free. And we encourage people to download it if you haven't already, and dig in where you can.
Awesome. Thank you, Dominique and Paul. I literally looked through the toolkit again yesterday in preparation for today, and I'm still learning stuff as I hear you all talking about it. So I appreciate that. We do have a lot of questions. I'm going to start with one that's hopefully super easy. First, Paul, you mentioned a data analysis tool, and there are a lot of people who are interested in the tool that you named. So could you please, I didn't catch it, but what was
I don't know that I mentioned a data analysis. I talked about targeted universalism as a practice. I don't recall talking about a specific data analysis tool. I think what I did talk about was that at the Collective Impact Forum, our other senior advisor, Junius Williams, does workshops on this that I think are enormously helpful, and I would encourage people to utilize as a resource to go deeper into understanding that, how to use data effectively and in a way that promotes equity.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. And hopefully that was the tool you all were referencing. But if not, I will encourage you all to also go to the Collective Impact Forum website and look at the resources page. There are tons of tools around each of these areas. All right, so one question that has a lot of upvotes is, it reads, in our communities, I have observed that more people are invested/interested in being at the table when funding is available. How do you keep people invested / interested when funding is not always available?
It's harder. It is harder. And so, I mean, part of the challenge, of course, is that you need, what keeps people at the table is momentum and the work advancing. And that's hard to do without funding to advance the work. That being said, I think if you have a critical mass of individuals who are in support of an agenda, then that gives you a greater chance of identifying funding. Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that I'll say the other thing is the reason why we come to the table is not for funding. It's not because we want to work together. It's not to like eat muffins and drink coffee together. It's because there is a result in our community that we recognize is both unjust and inequitable and is not acceptable to us. And if I'm at the table for any reason other than I think it's unconscionable that this percentage of children is not reading at grade level, or this level of women are having childbirth issues, that should be what drives us to be at the table. And hopefully the dollars can flow from that. But I see a lot of tables where people get stuck in activity and intention, and the purpose of the table, that population result, that thing we're trying to move, loses focus, and the inequity within that result loses focus. And the reason why I'm at that table, the reason why I'm involved with collective impact is not because I want to like help people do neat work. It's because of the promise, in a community where Dominique and I have worked at, where we're seeing affordable housing situation change dramatically, or seeing the homelessness situation change dramatically, or seeing actual real change that impacts people's lives and addresses inequities. And so, obviously we need the dollars, but if it's the dollars that are driving us and we're totally okay with the current level of performance in our community, that to me is a little unconscionable in most cases. We don't have a lot of communities that have great results, especially when you disaggregate.
Yeah, and I think, Paul, to that point, when we see tables that are built to focus on the result, focus on the outcome, the dollars do come, because those tend to be unique tables. Like there's a difference between that and just doing a bunch of activities and programs, et cetera. Like people can tell that this is a different way of doing the work.
Yeah. And money matters. Don't get me wrong. Like we need money. Like I don't like we're very clear. Like money matters, but like we have to keep the big picture front and center too.
Yeah,
absolutely. And keeping along these similar lines, this is for two other groups in terms of engaging them in the work. So there is a question, and I'll give both, and you all can decide which one you'd like to tackle first. But one is around engaging community, and how do you do that when there are so many barriers to community, like access to the work? You think about rural communities and the sort of the barriers that exist there to like getting them engaged in the work. And then the other question was around getting elected officials engaged, particularly when they may not have a vested interest in the work that you're doing.
Paul, you want to start?
Sure. On the community engagement side, again, the separate toolkit on that has a lot of resources, and again, is a free resource at the forum. But you have to ask, there's a lot to that, right? Like you got to be clear, what's our purpose for doing community engagement? Are we just trying to listen, or are we like really trying to build change? Because can you move a population of 15,000 women to better health outcomes through a program? No. If you don't have families, friends, and neighbors involved, you're not going to get to scale. And so we have to get clear that we can't get to the population change if we're not engaging community in a different way. Then the question is how to engage community. And there's some ways you can directly engage, and sometimes we can go through places where people are already meeting and engaged and working together. And I think so often we think that it's like community is like just an atomized space with all these individuals, instead of places that are filled with association where people are already coming together doing stuff. And how do you work with leaders and others who are already convening or have bases of people or engaging people to see if you can connect with them and work with their folks, or meet with their folks and build relationships. And so I think there's a lot of avenues in. I've always joked, but I've always meant it, that if you're like, don't know where to start, go to an event at a school and watch the parking lot afterward and see who's the parent who talks to all the other parents the most. And like, that's a good, like that person wants to talk. They need to talk. So you have someone, you can start and maybe get them to talk about something different. How do you just start to think about it differently and find those assets, and especially find those ways that people are already convened and meeting and working as a kind of asset or thing that you can tap into to connect better and work. And on the elected official side, I think that you've got to figure out how to manage that, because there are some elected officials who are very connected to community and are very much passionate about the results and willing to be adaptive in support of it. And there are some whose interest is getting press releases and in getting credit and other things. And the question is, what role can we have them play, and how do we manage it? And the person who's more looking for the credit in the press release, that's something we more have to manage. And that elected official, that city council member or state representative or someone else who's deeply passionate about the issue and wants to be engaged, we can probably engage them more fully. And so it's knowing the leader and what their intents are, and not trying to pretend they're something other than they are, and understand what their interests are and figure out how to manage that. Dominique?
Yeah, I think for the first part of the question, completely right. I think you have to right size your engagement for the outcome, and you don't have to be the holder of all the things. And so if there's someone doing engagement well, just tap onto that. I also don't think folks should, and I think this is how folks tend to think about engagement, as this kind of finite thing. I think thinking about engagement as an approach to the work. And so you definitely need it to inform an outcome. But if this coalition is working on population level changes, and the idea that it's going to be around, that it should just be an approach to the work, and understanding that you are, while you may be tapping into other people's relationships at the outset, and in the short term, should really be focused on how you are over time building relationships, and how you're it may take a long time, but that's part of the work, that you're actually investing in how you're building and cultivating those relationships. And I think exactly what Paul said around the elected officials, they're all different. They all have different motivations, and they all have people that are connected to them that can help you easily understand their motivations, and understand kind of how to engage them and kind of what will work for them. And I just want to give a shout out to Tony Panchera, because I saw him in the chat. Hey, Tony.
Thank you all. And what I'll quickly add something to what both Dominique and Paul have shared is also thinking about how you're bringing people together, right? Do people see value in the meetings that you're holding, right? Do people experience action, right? Or are they saying, well, I've been to that meeting, 3 times, and each time we've gone, I've left either feeling confused, or there's not been a very clear next step in the work. So also, I would recommend, if you all haven't read Priya Parker's The Art of Gathering, right, which talks about centering it around purpose and really pushing yourself to think about purpose of why people are gathering, right, and then curating the space in that way. But those things go a long way in engaging folks.
That is a great point, Courtney.
Yeah. And she spoke at our convening last year for the Collective Impact Forum. Mm-hmm. Also, I would just recommend, I did a blog for the forum called Making Meetings Work, which was based on an approach and lessons of how to make meetings way more engaging and inclusive, and to really motivate action and commitment. And so that's another resource I would recommend, because I think too many meetings suck. And I continue to see groups that still meet with everyone reporting at each other, instead of people doing collaborative, inclusive work together.
Absolutely. Thank you all. So I'm going to switch gears and go to a couple of more general questions that are steeped around race. So the first question states, I'm wondering about the work of folks of color too, in building the knowledge base of collective work for liberation and dialogue, as well as the processes that this equity toolkit comes from. And so they're asking if you all can speak a bit to that.
Can you restate the question?
Yeah, well, and I'll turn it into more of a question. So essentially they're wondering what is the work of folks of color in this? As you think about the Racial Equity Toolkit, what is their work, and specifically thinking about concepts around like liberation. Well, specifically liberation is what I think is lifting up. So sort of like what's the work for folks of color in this space?
Yeah, for me, it is number one, it depends. And number two, I think it is continuing to call the question. And so we are usually in the position of like filling the blind spot and calling the question. And continue to like push the boundary. And so I saw a question in the chat about affinity groups, and I have this love-hate relationship with affinity groups because people create them, and then it's one of those structural mechanisms that kind of push this work off to the side, right? Off to the margins. And so they're disempowered, they don't have any authority, there's no decision making. And so for me, it's all about like, okay, that's great, except for like, how is that actually informing and advancing the work? And so for people of color inside this work, I am always asking the question, at least for myself, and I think this is going to be different for everyone, of like, number one, what do I need inside of this work? And then how am I like standing in that and continuing to like bring that up, call the question, like make sure that that isn't lost as a way to step into my own dignity. And I think everybody has a different journey around that. But yeah, so that's my short answer, I guess.
Courtney, you're muted.
I'm very much muted. Sorry, y'all. So what would you add to that, if anything?
What she said. I mean, I think some people in the chat talked about the national do equity alone in affinity and across difference, and goes back to building bridges, creating. Yeah, I mean, like it's all that, right? Like it's like I think we all, Dominique early on talked about grace, and I think the thing that I've been the benefit of a lot of grace throughout my career, which I'm very grateful for. The people who taught me and the people who didn't push me away when I failed or when I made mistakes. And I see sometimes when people struggle to do this work, this fear to make mistakes. And I think, as Dominique said, I think when you build relationships and trust with people, the ability for people to trust when you're screwing up where it's coming from and be able to help you and show you some grace, and not holding you accountable. Of course, you got to be accountable. But I think that the thing that people can do is just create space and recognize that difference between somebody who's trying their best and on a learning journey. Dominique always says this thing that always kind of arrests me, which is, she says, if I was born where you were born in your family with your situation, I would probably think like you do, right? Like I think we all kind of are come from a context, and in trying to learn different things, I think we have to be open to we're going to make mistakes, we're going to step in it, and hopefully if we're open to learning and improving and being accountable, we can all get better.
But it's hard to do that. I would just add, it's hard to do that outside of relationship. And so part of the reason why we don't do this work well is because we're not in enough relationship with each other to actually have the difficult conversations. And so Paul and I can have these conversations, and I can call him out on stuff and he can call me out on stuff, because I know at the end of the day that he loves me and that he respects me and that he appreciates me. Whereas with another white person, we could not have the same conversations. And so we're trying to do this work outside of relationship with each other, which means feelings are hurt, things are left unsaid. And this is not work that can be done having the same conversations that we've always had. We have to get to a point where we're having different conversations. This work won't happen without having different conversations. It has to be both grace, and I think somebody put this in the chat, grace and accountability, but like we have to be in different kinds of relationships with each other. And yeah.
Don't do it on social media. That's not where to do it.
Right. I'm like, you can go to Ken Universe.
Don't do social media.
I'll try to help you out.
Yeah.
But no, that's absolutely important. And even like to take it a step further, like trust, right? There's a level of trust that exists that allows you to be vulnerable and have those types of conversations.
Yeah.
That's right.
And Dominique just mentioned Kin University, and if Tracy could put in the link to that, Dominique's created an effort to help people build relationship and have these conversations. And it's Kin, K-I-N. Yeah. And so there's a website for it, and hopefully a link will be in soon, but it's a great resource. It's up now. Great. Thank you. That Dominique created to support those conversations and relationship building.
Awesome. And thank you for that offering, Paul. So the second question around race, and I'm going to paraphrase this question, so apologies to the person who wrote it. It's a bit meaty, but essentially they're interested for folks who identify as mixed race, with white being one of those races. How would you recommend that they navigate this toolkit? Is it honoring both of those races? Is it the race you most identify with, et cetera?
That's such an interesting question. And I don't know if I would have had this answer before, like a month ago. So every year I do this Women's History Project on Instagram, and this year I did only Black women, and several of the folks I talked to were biracial. And what I gleaned from that was that, being biracial is as much of a racial experience as it is a cultural experience. And so for one of the participants, culturally, she fully identifies as a Black woman. And so she would not have much to, her experience in the world is as a Black woman. And the other young lady, not as much. And so I think it's so dependent on your actual experience in the world. And so culturally and racially, how do you identify? How do you walk through the world? What are your experiences in both of those worlds? And then as you're moving through the toolkit, what is coming up for you? Have you moved through the world as a white presenting person? Have you primarily moved through? I think that's just so personal. And it's going to depend. It's going to shift person by person. And I think Paul can speak to this too. He has biracial children, and I know he's had conversations around this.
Yeah, I think that, it is a very provocative question. And I think that, Dominique, your answer is kind of right on from how I would say it is. I think that how you racially and culturally identify will kind of guide how you walk through it. But I also think you're going to have a different experience than either going through it. And so I think it's really, again, finding your path for what you can learn and bring from this in your work with folks, because I know that's a very different experience, and it's a very, so I think I think people just have a different way of navigating and figuring out what works for you in the conversation is important.
Thank you both. So our next question is around accountability. And essentially the person is asking, what suggestions do you have for documenting accountability? In some further context, they work at an organization that wants metrics and spreadsheets with dates. However, the work is not linear and it's transformative. So it's not going to follow a flow chart or anything like that.
Yeah, still work plan it and bring it into your conversations and meetings. And that's the thing, is that you still have to set, and understanding that it's not linear, but you still have to set metrics. And even if the goalpost is moving a bit, you still have to be able to name it and have the conversations about why or why not. Or else it's just lost. It's lost in the ether, and you never get it back. And I am not the best work planner. I'm looking at Paul, and because this is really his lane, but he has, he's made me a believer in the accountability really does require this documentation, even if that's not, because I'm not a linear thinker. I'm not I tend towards that side, but you do need some level of documentation and integration into however you meet, however you dialogue, in order to make sure that you're holding yourselves accountable enough to advance the work.
So as a white guy, I have a tendency to, sometimes, and an introvert, but who sometimes thinks out loud, I can process too much and also be dominant in meetings. I'm aware I do that. I can be accountable by sharing that with people that I do that and asking them when I'm doing that to let me know I'm doing that so I can like be aware and back off. That's a form of accountability. Another form of accountability is saying our organization or coalition will make sure that every table has X percentage of participation by the end of this year. Or we will make sure that we're increasing resources to these types of organizations. So metrics don't have to be like the percentage of X.
Right.
It can be a milestone. It can be, I can be accountable by stating this is something I want to change and I want you to hold me accountable to. I can be accountable for saying we as an entity will never convene a meeting where less than half the seats are held by people of color, and we can be accountable to that. I can say we're going to go out and hire a backbone team, and we're going to make sure that that backbone team is reflective of the population we're serving, and I can be accountable to that. So I think sometimes we get stuck in being anti-metrics in a way that actually allows us to be unaccountable for actually making the change. And again, I think we can make commitments with accountability and timelines. And I think a lot of times leaders dodge racial equity by speaking of their intents and how much they care and like hanging signs up behind them. But have they made sure the majority of their board is people of color? Have they made sure, like, that's like you can be accountable for that. And that's why we have that last section on leadership, equity, leadership, and accountability is you have to make that commitment and then hold accountable to it. And so you don't need to have, everything doesn't have to be a spreadsheet, but it has to be visible. Like, and if we say we're going to do that, then we like check in on how are we doing on that. If we say we're not going to convene meetings that don't have this participation, then, and we have a meeting it doesn't, then we're meeting afterwards, say, hey, we didn't get that. What are we going to do to fix it? Because we're accountable to it. So I think being accountable is not the same as having metrics for everything, but visible commitments, meaning documented somewhere, and we come back to them, because the other thing I see people is they make commitments and they go off in the ether. So how do we keep it present? Do we keep it on the bottom of our agenda? The 3 questions we ask at the end of every meeting, you know, and we put it at the bottom of the agenda so we make sure we're holding ourselves accountable. Lots of ways to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what I'll quickly add, more technical notes around doing that. So one of the practices that I use in supporting collaborative groups was, like, to Paul's point, your commitments were there on every agenda. People checked in around those commitments at the top of every meeting. And it wasn't a, aha, got you, or you didn't do it right. It's where are you, or what progress have you made, right? And then there were questions that we would ask to get people to think through, like, if you didn't get a chance, right, to follow through on your commitment, what is it then going to take? What supports do you need? Or is this a commitment, right, that still holds true for you? Or do you need to make a different commitment? I would also offer, it's called the accountability pathway. And it literally gives both language and visuals to, like, everywhere from, like, I am not accountable, I'm claiming that I was unaware
Right.
that I made a commitment, to, you know, I knocked it out the park. And it has sets of questions based on where you self-identify along that pathway that gets you to, because again, it's about getting us to, like, how do we hold this commitment, or what do we need to do differently? So I would offer those 2 things as well.
That integration for me is like key. Like, it has to be integrated into however you meet, however you have conversations, like whatever that looks like for you all, or else it just falls away.
It does, and people forget easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm gonna pivot to a question around data, and the question that's being asked is, how do you balance gathering data from an asset-based approach while conducting a process to reveal root causes, which typically focus on problems or issues?
So in my experience, being asset-based doesn't mean denying that problems exist or the realities around them.
Hmm.
It's the recognition that, you know, my teacher, rest his soul, Jody Kretzman, and John, now you're still with us, you know, you always use the metaphor of the glass, and that the glass is half empty or and half full, right? It's both. And being asset-based does not mean that we like ignore the emptiness. It just means that where do you start and how do you frame? And so I think that we don't deny the emptiness is there, but how are we also drawing a picture of what's working? And so the example, I mean, a couple examples just of things of like, if we know that 40% of kids are not reading at grade level, that's tragic, but it also means 60% of children are. So let's not define 100% by the 40%, which is a tendency I see people do, where they then make it the whole community suffers from that, or that all children are failing. I think you can also really think about what are the things you can frame in terms of what's working and who's working and what exists in community along with the data about community. And again, I think that facing the realities of the community is not being somehow like asset-based isn't some religion where you like can only talk about it's the idea that like in solving for that disparity, where does community sit? Are they something we're doing something to? Are they someone we're doing work with? Or are we supporting work by? And I think it's the idea that being asset-based is understanding how do we move from doing to doing with or supporting work by. It doesn't mean denying that that problem exists. That's systemic and needs to be addressed. And so I think again, sometimes I've seen people try to use asset-based as a mask for not being real about the data and what's going on in community.
Mm-hmm. And the only thing I would add to that, and this is something we share in our community engagement workshop, is oftentimes when we're defining community through a deficit-based lens, we're coming in and viewing ourselves and our coalition and our work through an asset-based lens. Like we're here looking at ourselves as like, we have so much to give you, you're empty, I'm full, here, let me give you some of my fullness, as opposed to being realistic about both.
Yes, yes, and yes. Thank you all. So this next question had quite a few votes as well. Can you please describe the difference between white people who are trying to quote unquote do the work and not rely on people of color, while also recognizing the negative aspects of white savior syndrome? What concrete examples can you provide for well-intentioned white folks who want to shed the white savior mentality?
Paul, do you want to start on that one?
I think that the key, when I'm coming into a community to help a community, there's an othering just in that concept. You know, like I'm not saying I want, again, the with is gone. I'm now coming in with a to. I'm coming in to do work in a community or for a community. And so the question is, are you coming in to build relationship, or are you coming in to do good that you want to be seen as being doing good? And so I think there's also a level of kind of like, I get frustrated at times when I see people who, whose voluntarism is almost a way of them trying to say, I've done the work, instead of actually doing the work, being in relationship, being connected, having the conversations, doing the work. And so I see people putting a lot of resources in there, and there's a lot of that space. And I think sometimes we trip up too. Like, I'm not saying I've always been perfect in that regard, but I think that we can be thoughtful about what our intent is. And again, I think that piece we talked about a few times, how are you doing this on the community's terms and not your own? And how am I doing this in a way with humility and with partnership, and not in a way where I'm coming in? There's, in that asset-based glass half empty, half full, we always tell the story that if I believe the community is the empty half of the glass and the people in it have problems that make them empty, and I see myself as full and able to fill them up, I'm being oppressive. But if I see myself in a way that understands that I'm half empty, half full, they've got fullness, they've got emptiness, and we can find ways to build relationship and do work together, that's a different way of approaching it. And so I think just really being thoughtful about like doing the work. And I think that's the other just thing I'll keep going back to is, are you just coming in to like get in and out, or are you building relationship and doing the work?
Yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts coming up.
Yeah.
This, part of it for me is just like it requires such a level of self-awareness about who you are in the world and what motivates you. Um, and and honestly, like most people, let alone most white people, I feel like don't have that. So like, why are you even attracted to this work, right? Like unpacking that for yourself is critically important. And I don't think that most people unpack that for themselves. Yeah, I think it, not being a white person, I think this would require such a level of like self-awareness and depth and like unpacking of like, okay, why am I here? And then how is that informing how and why I show up? And it's literally at every step because you have been born into a context of dominance. And so like everything has been set up as one up, one down. And so it feels like it would be almost impossible not to view the world that way, and like including this work. And so it just would require you reeling that all the way back constantly. I know that probably wasn't that helpful, but yeah, I would have to just give that a little bit more thought about what that as a practice would actually look like.
Well, thank you both. And I do want to lift up that in the chat, people are offering resources around that. So we'd encourage you all to take a look at those as well.
Yeah, I see Paulo Freire and the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which certainly in White Saviorism, the book, and there's also the article, The White Savior Industrial Complex, and some of it has to do with also like global work, especially work in Africa, which I always find weird when people go to Africa to help Black people and don't do anything in the United States for Black people. And you're like, what's that about? And I think it goes back to Dominique's point about just being aware of what your motives and intents and doing the work. Like, this is a journey, so we've got to be thoughtful about it. So appreciate all the comments from people.
Absolutely. We have a few minutes left, and we have quite a few questions centered around moving from the individual. How do you all see people using this toolkit, and how can they use it in, I guess, more mixed spaces, right? So as they think about the coalition spaces that aren't organizations, right, where we're already naturally connected to people, how can people use the toolkit in that regard?
How can people use the toolkit? I'm sorry.
So essentially, folks are asking questions around how do they use it with the coalition? How are they using it, with cross-collaborative groups, et cetera? What are some ways they might think about holding space with the toolkit? And particularly not, essentially like people not losing steam around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think number one, it depends on where you are in the work, and it's designed to be used, like you can use it as a toolkit as a whole. You can use it as individuals and with the collective, which is how it's designed, but you can also like pull out pieces and like, this is what we want to concentrate on. This is what we're focusing on right now. So we're just going to focus on this piece. So I think we try to design it in a way that people could use it in a variety of ways, depending on where they are in the work, what their current capacity was, and what they wanted to focus on. Paul, any other thoughts you'd like to share?
I think the same thing. And I would just say what we said up front too, which is you might, if you like, maybe you like work on it bits at a time in a group and have it be part of your meetings to work through different pieces of it. And for the harder pieces, bring in a facilitator and just like engage in the conversations. But I think one of the powerful things you could do, even with a steering committee, is do those 4 activities that start up front, or do one a meeting with your steering committee and have people share their examples with each other we have that task where people put 5 or 6 milestones on a map of what's influenced their thinking. You could put those up on a wall and have people look at them and talk about them in pairs, and like have a way for your team to actually like discuss it and think about it and understand how people came to it. So you can work through it in a variety of ways. And again, if someone wanted to do the whole thing, it would be a process. And I think building time and really working through it would take some time to do, but would be useful, but would not happen in one meeting. It would probably take several meetings to work together through it. And again, people doing their individual homework on the front end to make that possible.
Thank you both. And using, go to your world, Dominique, closing arguments, if you will. But what is, I guess, one thing you all would want people to step away from today's webinar, like holding to them? If there was just one thing that they could remember or take away to help them do this work.
Action.
Yeah,
Take action and commit and be accountable.
Yeah, mine was accountability. That like at the end of the day, and if you know me, which some people out here do, I'm all about like the personal journey. But if that personal journey does not translate to action and accountability, then it's all for naught. Then you're serving yourself again. You're centering yourself again. And that's, the worst.
Absolutely. And what I'm going to put myself into this, but Paul, you said something that's like, I think incredibly powerful, but like doing this work on the community's terms, I think that just like should shift the way people think about the work. So yeah, that's what I would leave with you all, is doing it on the community's term. Like what does community say they need, and how do we be in response to that, is what I would leave with. So I want to thank both Dominique and Paul for a wonderful conversation today. I want to thank each of you for joining us from all around the world today and taking time out of your schedules. A couple of things to note. So one, I wish I had like some sound effects right now. The Collective Impact Action Summit is next week. We kick off next Tuesday. So we hope that you all are registered. If not, you do still have time to register for the summit. So we encourage you to visit the website and do that, and also tell a friend about it. I also encourage you all to both go through the toolkit and also listen to the podcast episode that Dominique and Paul recorded about a month and a half ago as well, which has some beautiful gems as well. But again, we thank you for your time today on behalf of the Collective Impact Forum team. Thank you all so much and have a great day.